Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome to another Pokemon character study. I haven't done one of these videos for a while, so in case you're not sure what this video series is all about, allow me to get you up to speed. In the Pokemon character study videos, I like to take a look at specific characters or trainers in the Pokemon world, make an entire video dedicated to them. I look at their personality, their Pokemon teams, the story behind them, popular theories, and what more. I even compare their different versions across the anime, games, and manga. There's tons of videos out there that focus on the Pokemon themselves, which is awesome, but I feel that many of the trainers in the Poke world are pretty interesting too, which is why I was inspired to start this video series last year. I mean, nobody would ever give someone like Riley or Mr. Fuji a second glance, so hopefully these videos can help highlight the often overlooked human characters that exist. It's kind of ironic that I mentioned smaller and overlooked characters, because the character study today is going to be focusing on one of the major rival characters out there. Whether you call him Silver, Douche, or slightly female-looking red-haired kid, today we're going to be talking about the rival from Pokemon's second generation. Let's kick things off with the game version. Silver appears in only the Generation 2 games, Gold, Silver, and Crystal, as well as their Gen 4 remakes, Heart Gold and Soul Silver. He also makes a small appearance as the ultimate trainer you can battle in Pokemon Stadium 2, where he uses a lot of insane Pokemon, but I'm not going to be talking too much about that, because there's a ton of info of him in the mainline games I want to go over first. He has long, sort of feminine red hair and wears dark blue clothing with red highlights. If he looks sort of intimidating or kind of like a jerk, then that's for good reason, as he acts as the player's rival throughout the games. Before we talk about his whole life story though, let's quickly address the topic of his name. In the title of this video, and even in the intro, I call this guy Silver, but if you can believe it, this character doesn't actually have an official name, as far as the video games go at least. Just like the rival of the original games, you were allowed to name this character. Unlike the Gen 1 rival, however, the Generation 2 rival never received an official name later on. In fact, in Gen 4, when the player character of the remakes got an official name, the rival still went on nameless. So what's the deal here? Why do people call him Silver? Well, when picking a name for him, if you were able to refrain from naming him something inappropriate and just left his name blank, it would default to certain names based on what you were playing. If you were playing Heart Gold, his name would become Soul Silver it would become Heart, Silver it would become Gold, and of course, if you're playing Pokemon Gold or Crystal and left his name blank, it would become Silver. As you're probably aware, Silver was the name that stuck and proceeded to be his quote-unquote official name. Why that name stuck and not one of his other default names is anybody's guess. Maybe it's because more games defaulted to the name Silver, or perhaps it was influenced by one of the manga versions of this character whose official name is actually Silver. Either way, Silver is what everybody calls him, and until he has an official name, which probably is never going to happen, I'll call him that too. Let's briefly go over Silver's story in the main series games now. Keep in mind that unless otherwise specified, the events that I'm going to be talking about are in both the original games and the remakes. There's only a couple times that Silver's story was changed or added onto between the two generations, and I'll address those moments when they come up. Overall, his actions and character are almost identical between all the games he's been in, so let's jump right in and take a brief look at the story of one of my favorite characters in all of Pokemon. The first time we see Silver is outside of Professor M's laboratory, where you see him peering inside. When the player confronts him, he brushes them off with a hostile attitude, going so far as to physically shove the player back. You better get used to his abrasive attitude right now, because he's like this almost the whole game. After the player visits Mr. Pokemon on Route 30 and is returning back to New Barktown on request from Professor Elm, they bump into Silver in Cherry Grove City, who challenges them to a battle. During the battle, it's shown that Silver has stolen one of Professor Elm's starter Pokemon, which is always the one that is super effective against whichever the player picked. Once beaten, Silver gives us a small glimpse at his goals by saying that he wants to be the world's greatest Pokemon trainer. At this point, Silver and the player part ways, and Silver travels to the Sprout Tower in Violet City, where he defeats the top stage of the building. The player arrives right before Silver is about to exit, and Silver finally shares a little bit more of his inner thoughts with everybody. He says that he only cares about strength and strong Pokemon, and doesn't care at all about being nice to Pokemon, or at ones that are weak. This gives us great insight into Silver's personality. Almost every encounter you have with him in the game, he has this type of attitude, where he wants to become more powerful but neglects his Pokemon and even people around him because of it. His views of strength and power are based purely on the physical aspect of it, and he doesn't recognize that being friendly and forming a bond with his Pokemon is another equally important side of strength. His rivalry with the player character is even formed because he doesn't understand how the player keeps beating him, even though he has what he considers to be the strongest Pokemon. After leaving Sprout Tower, Silver then travels south, where he runs into the player character yet again, this time in Azalea Town. Silver's been doing a little bit of training, it seems like, and has two new Pokemon on his team, a Ghastly and a Zubat, as well as the mid-evolution of his starter. Apparently Silver is a little bit out of the know and asks the player if it's true that Team Rocket has returned from their absence. Once beaten in a battle, we learn more about Silver's hatred when he says that he hates the weak in general, whether it be Pokemon, trainers, Team Rocket, it doesn't matter who or what it is to him. He wants to become the strongest and greatest trainer just to wipe out all of the weak. There's a couple interesting things to note about what he says here. The first is that his dialogue has actually changed between the original games and the remakes. In the original games, he says that he wants to be strong to wipe out the weak, while in the remakes, the line about wiping out the weak is completely removed. It's unknown as to why this was changed, but I imagine it was to make him sound a little bit less intense. I mean, wanting to get strong to wipe out all of the weak people in Pokemon sounds a little bit insane. The second thing I find really interesting about what he says here is that he calls out Team Rocket by name, saying that they act big and strong as a group, but separated they're weak. He pulls no punches in saying that he actively hates Team Rocket and warns the player to stay out of his way. It seems like there might be a little bit more to his hatred of weakness in Team Rocket than he lets on, but we'll talk about that a little bit later on. The next time we see Silver is at the Burn Tower in Ecruteak City, where he says that he's traveled there looking to capture the legendary Pokemon that resides inside. He has a brand new Pokemon on his team, Magnemite, and has a whole lot of confidence that he can win. Spoiler alert, he does not. After departing Ecruteak, Silver would then travel to Olivine City to try and challenge the gym leader. It's never explicitly stated in either of the generations that he's battling the gym leaders, but when the player arrives in Olivine City, they run into him coming out of the gym, where he mentions that the gym leader isn't there. This leads me to speculate that he's also challenging gym leaders alongside the player. While you don't battle him in Olivine City, I always felt the urge to fight him because he talks about how the gym leader is taking care of a sick Pokemon and how sick Pokemon are worthless, and if a Pokemon can't battle, it should just be let go. Silver is literally the meanest rival ever. In fact, when the player goes to Cyanwood City to get the medicine for the sick Ampharos, they find out that Silver has already been there and stolen somebody's Sneasel. Silver has no limits on what he'll do to get what he considers to be stronger, and stealing a Pokemon is just one of the awful things he does. Fortunately for him, he gets put into his place by Lance of the Elite Four. Later in the game, when Lance and the player are investigating the Team Rocket headquarters underneath Mahogany Town, the player bumps into Silver, who seems a little bit agitated. While we don't see it happen, apparently Lance totally stomped on Silver in a battle. Silver also mentions that Lance told him that he doesn't love or trust his Pokemon enough. Silver just shrugs it off and is annoyed he lost to a softy like Lance and says that if he gets stronger Pokemon, then he'll surely be able to beat him. Silver is clearly still thinking about strength in the same way as the beginning of the game, and even after being beaten and given advice by one of the strongest trainers of the region, he's still believing in his misguided philosophy. After clearing out the Rocket HQ, the player heads to the Goldenrod radio tower to shut down Team Rocket's nefarious plan. This next part I'm going to talk about is something that only happens in Heart Gold and Soul Silver. In order to get into the radio tower, the player has the awesome idea to disguise themselves as the Team Rocket grunt. They get pretty close to pulling it off, but Silver shows up at the worst possible moment and sees right through their disguise, forcing the player to switch clothes. Once the player reverts back to normal adventure wear, Silver berates the player for their plan, saying that trying to be sneaky is a typical idea of the meek. He decides to let the player handle Team Rocket on their own and says that while they're doing that, he wants to go challenge and defeat Lance. The player then makes their way to the Goldenrod Tunnel to try and gain access to the top of the radio tower, when lo and behold, they meet a very familiar face yet again. As it turns out, Silver actually lied about going to go fight Lance in order to hopefully trick the player into leading him to Lance. I guess he forgot all about what he said earlier, that being sneaky and tricking people is a sign of weakness, because that's literally what he just does. It's at this point that both generations of the game's events start to match up again, and Silver challenges the player to a battle. His team consists of all his previous Pokemon, except that he's using his stolen Sneasel, his Zubat has evolved into a Golbat, his Ghastly has evolved into a Haunter, and his starter Pokemon has fully evolved, except for some reason, if he has a Quilava, it still hasn't fully evolved yet. Upon defeat, Silver sounds exhausted, and I honestly start to feel a little bit bad for him. He says, and I quote, "I don't understand. Is what that Lance guy said true? That I don't treat Pokemon properly? Love, trust, are they really what I lack? Are they keeping me from winning? I just don't understand. But it's not going to end here. Not now. Not because of this. I won't give up my dream of becoming the world's best Pokemon trainer." It seems that Silver is finally starting to grasp what it is he lacks as a trainer, and at this point he also starts to recognize the player as having true strength. In a scene that was added to Heart Gold and Soul Silver, when the player is back in Ecruteak City about to fight the Kimono Girls, they run into Silver as he is leaving. Silver acknowledges that the player beat Team Rocket and says that he doesn't want to go back into where the Kimono Girls are because he doesn't want to see the player beat them. After his defeat at the hands of the Kimono Girls in Heart Gold and Soul Silver, or after being beaten in the Goldenrod Tunnel by the player in Gold, Silver, and Crystal, Silver would then head to Victory Road, presumably to train his Pokemon. He encounters the player while they're on their way to the Elite Four and challenges them to a battle. He has a full team now consisting of his fully evolved starter, a Golbat, a Magneton, his Haunter, a Sneasel, and a newly caught Kadabra to get his team up to 6. The battle is hard fought, but in the end the player overcomes him. It's now that Silver openly admits to his defeat and vows to become stronger. He wants to further understand Lance's words to him and aims to grasp why he can't win and what he's doing wrong. You then meet up with him much later on in Mount Moon of the Kanto region. He openly admits to the player's strength, but says that he can't help but challenge you. His team is the exact same one that he used in Victory Road, except this time his Pokemon are higher levels, and his Kadabra and Haunter have both evolved. Upon defeat this time, he admits that the player won fair and square, but he still has frustration that he keeps losing. In Heart Gold and Soul Silver, he says that he senses his Pokemon getting stronger. In order to train them to the max, he decides to visit the Dragon's Den. If the player in Heart Gold and Soul Silver decides to go to the Dragon's Den at this point, they can actually talk to Silver outside of the building, who reveals that the master of the den won't train him, so he decides to train on his own. Lance and Claire show up, and Silver, having wanted to have a rematch with Lance for a while now, challenges him to a battle. Lance accepts, but decides to turn this one-on-one battle into a multi-battle, and calls to the player to be on his team. When Silver is supposed to be paired up with Claire, he refuses, dissing her weird costume and instead pairing up with the player to take on Lance and Claire in a double battle. In the battle, Silver only uses 3 Pokemon, his fully evolved starter, his Gengar, and interestingly enough his Golbat, which has now evolved into a Crobat. Him having a Crobat might seem trivial, but it really speaks wonders about how Silver has personally progressed. Golbat only evolves into Crobat through friendship, and the fact that Silver has one at this point proves how much he has grown and changed as a trainer. Another small detail that shows his progression is that his Pokemon is actually outside of its Pokeball when the player first sees him in the den. This is truly the point where you can see Silver's change into a more caring trainer, but his story isn't over yet. The final encounter the player has with Silver is at the Indigo Plateau, and this happens in both generations. When the player is going in to re-challenge the Elite Four, they're stopped by Silver, inside the lobby no less. He wants to challenge the player one final time to a Pokemon battle. Silver's team is the same as before, and once beaten, Silver ultimately claims defeat. Although something strange happens, this time when he talks to you, he sounds a lot different. He says that he needs to believe more in his Pokemon, and that he's sorry to have gotten in the way. He also says to make sure to rest your Pokemon before challenging the champion. Compared to how Silver was at the start of the game, there's such a huge difference in progression to him. He grew from somebody who sought after only the physical strength of Pokemon at any cost, neglecting the emotional and friendship side of things, to someone who's really learned to care and love for his Pokemon. Even though he never really wins and is probably still trying to get stronger, I think he really does have true strength in his own way. Before we stop talking about the game version and switch over to the anime and manga stuff, I need to briefly talk about one of the biggest plot points Silver has, which is something that actually isn't mentioned at all during the main story. In fact, this piece of info wasn't in the original Gold, Silver, and Crystal, and was briefly hinted at in Fire Red and Leaf Green, only to be revealed full-fledged in Heart Gold and Soul Silver through an event. In Fire Red and Leaf Green, one of the scientists in the Sevi Islands asks the player if he's Giovannis Son, but says that he isn't because Giovanni's son has red hair. You might think that's just a throwaway line of dialogue, but in Heart Gold and Soul Silver, there's actually a special event where the player is able to travel 3 years into the past to right after Giovanni is defeated during the events of the original games, and see Giovanni and Silver interacting on Route 22. If there's still any doubt that Silver is Giovanni's son, in the Japanese version of the game, he actually calls Giovanni Dad, which would confirm their relationship. Before we get into their exchange, I've just got to say that I think that Silver being Giovanni's son is such an awesome idea. This explains so much about him. Why Silver hates Team Rocket so much, why he has such misguided thoughts about strength and Pokemon at the start of the games, all of it can be traced back to Giovanni abandoning Silver 3 years prior to the games. As for their exchange, it's pretty much Silver trying to understand how Giovanni failed with Team Rocket. Giovanni says that putting together the strength and potential of a group of people is how you get a huge amount of power, but admits that he failed to use his subordinate's potential the best. Silver isn't satisfied with his answer and just doesn't understand him. He vows that he will never become someone like his father, a person that he views to be weak and a coward. This is where Silver makes the goal of wanting to become the strongest trainer out there and ultimately influences his personality and character for the events of Generation 2 and its remakes. This event, in my opinion, should have been part of the main quest of the games. Knowing Silver's backstory when you go through and play the games adds so much to it. When you know why he has such a strong hatred of Team Rocket and why he endeavors for strength, it makes his story so much better and interesting. One last thing I should address that I'm sure you guys have probably thought about since the part where I mentioned that Giovanni was Silver's father is who exactly is Silver's mother? While we never get confirmation on who it is, one popular theory is that Ariana, one of Team Rocket's admins, is his mother. Aside from the noticeable hair similarities between her and Silver, she and Giovanni would have potentially been working together closely in the early years of Team Rocket, so it's entirely possible that her and Giovanni could have gotten together. There's not really a whole lot of evidence for this theory outside of what I mentioned, but it's definitely a fun one to think about. And this has been a relatively brief overview of Silver from the games. I know I've said it a bunch already, but he is one of, if not my favorite rival in Pokemon. I love the progression and development he goes through, and knowing that he's Giovanni's son through all of it really makes his story stand out to me. There's nothing wrong with the friendly rivals that we get in Pokemon games now, but Silver's mean personality and evolution throughout the games make him stand out so much more than the others. Now that we've covered the entirety of Silver in the games, let's switch gears over to the anime and his appearances in it. Surprisingly, there's actually very little. The only appearance he has is in the Japanese opening for The Legend of Thunder, which is a TV movie spin-off in Japan, and also the first 3 episodes of the Pokemon Chronicles spin-off series. In the opening, he is shown briefly with the Nidoking after presumably beating Jimmy in a battle. A couple seconds later, Jimmy's Typhlosion beats his Nidoking. It's about 2 seconds total screen time, and every time I see it, it makes me a little bit sad. It kind of sucks that one of the best Pokemon rivals from the games was sort of sidelined in the anime. Can you imagine what it would have been like if Ash had Silver as a rival during the Johto journeys? While Silver was never officially in the anime after his small cameo, there was a character introduced later on in the Diamond and Pearl series that many people believe was inspired by him. Paul's his name and being a jerk is his game. I'm not going to go in depth and talk too much about Paul as I don't consider him to necessarily be a version of Silver, but due to his personality and mantra of being very tough on his Pokemon and trying to attain more and more strength and power, he does give off a very Game Silver vibe. Paul would constantly check the stats of Pokemon he caught on his Pokedex, and if he deemed them to be too weak or worthless, he would then release them. He even released a Chimchar for being too scared and weak. The irony of this is that Ash would eventually come to care for and train this Chimchar and find that it had true potential due to his friendship and bond with it that Paul didn't have. There's a ton of information about Paul, and because he's technically not a version of Silver, I'll save a more in-depth character study on him for the future. In terms of Ash's rivals, Paul is definitely one of the more interesting ones, and I think that many people agree that he's one of the hardest ones Ash has ever had. Alright, we've almost made it to the end of the video, so let's talk about the last notable versions of Silver, the manga versions. There's actually a few different manga versions of him out there, so I'm just going to talk about 2 of them quickly. The first manga version of Silver we should talk about is seen in the Pokemon Gold and Silver The Golden Boys manga, and actually goes by the name Black in it. This version of the character is pretty similar to the games, where he actually steals his starter, a Chikorita in this case, and talks all about how he hates weak people and Pokemon. One key difference between this version and the game version, however, is that Black actually goes so far as to release Pokemon that he deems weak. He's shown to release a Pidgey in the beginning and is starting Bayleaf, both of them for underperforming in battles. There's really not too much to say about this version because he is very similar to the game version. The other and final manga version of Silver I want to talk about is of course the Pokemon Adventures / Pokemon Special version. It's no secret that I love Pokemon Adventures, so I'll try my best to keep this version's synopsis as brief as possible. In Pokemon Adventure, Silver, which is his official name in the manga, first debuted in the Gold and Silver chapter. While he seems to parallel the game version by stealing a starter, Totodile, and forming a rivalry against Gold, Silver's ambition in the manga isn't tied necessarily to becoming the strongest trainer. Rather, Silver wants to take down a character known as the Masked Man, which is a manga-only character that he seems to have a pretty negative connection with. Just like the game, Silver is the son of Giovanni, and interestingly enough, it was revealed in the manga that he was Giovanni's son long before the games ever elaborated on it. Silver's relationship with his father is kind of a different one, because rather than being abandoned like the game version, this Silver was actually kidnapped as a child and didn't grow up knowing his father at all. Because of this, his hatred for Team Rocket doesn't come from his father, but rather from the Masked Man. He doesn't approve of Giovanni being part of Team Rocket though, and has a difficult time accepting his heritage as the heir of Team Rocket. Eventually he comes to accept his father as having both good and bad sides though. There's a ton more info about the manga version of Silver, but I wanted to keep this section relatively spoiler free in case someone out there wants to read the manga and doesn't want to be spoiled about everything Silver does. This wraps up the character study on Silver. Silver is one of the few characters out there that has so many different versions, and most of them all have similar philosophies regarding training and strength. For me personally, I think my favorite version of Silver is the game one, due to how we actually get to see him change and evolve through the course of the game, and him being Giovannis Son just makes his transformation all the more awesome. Well, what do you think about Silver? Do you like him and feel for him? Maybe you hate him and he pushed you to the brink. Perhaps you wish that more rivals in Pokemon were similar to him. Feel free to share your own thoughts on Silver in the comments section below. Thanks for watching, and what a waste of time. Hey, thanks so much for watching this video. If you want to check out more videos I've made in the character study series, you can click right over here to see one I made about the mysterious Mr. Fuji, and right over here to see one about the equally mysterious Aura user Riley. I guess lots of people in the Pokemon world are mysterious, who would have thought? More than that though, I'd love to get some feedback on this video. I've been planning to bring back the character study series for a while now, and any sort of critique or feedback you guys can give me would be really appreciated on my part. Like if there's a character you'd like to see me cover, or if you want to see me spend more time talking about the manga versions and less about the game versions, or anything like that, please just leave a comment just with any sort of feedback. I want to make these videos the best that I can. The goal is to have one character study video out every month, so hopefully you guys can give me some good feedback, and I can improve on them and make them really awesome. Thanks again for watching, you guys, and I'll catch you later.